We all know the face of Yuri Gagarin, the hero, the first man in space. But history is a collection of stories we've agreed to believe. We are told that on April 12th, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to touch the stars. We've seen the film, we've heard the Poyakali, but in the deeper, darker corridors of the Soviet military archives, there are whispers of a different name, a name that was scrubbed from the leadvers, airbrushed from the photographs, and buried in an unmarked grave of bureaucracy. That name is Aleksei Ledovskikh. Long before the world celebrated a hero, it ignored a sacrifice. Because in a race to conquer the heavens, the Soviet Union wasn't just building rockets, it was building a narrative. And in that narrative, there was no room for failure. The year was 1960. The Cold War wasn't just a political standoff, it was a fever. To the Kremlin, space wasn't about science, it was about supremacy. Every failed launch was a blow to the perceived perfection of the communist machine. While the United States publicized its setbacks, the USSR operated in a vacuum of absolute silence. Deep in the Siberian wilderness, at a site far from the cameras of Baikonur, a prototype sat on a rusted launch pad. It wasn't the polished Vostok we know today. It was a raw, experimental sphere of steel and rivets. A Vostok 1P, it was a gamble. And Aleksei Ledovskikh was the man chosen to hold the cards. Who was Ledovskikh? If you look at the official records of the Soviet space program, he doesn't exist. He is a ghost. But declassified telemetry data from 1960 tells a different story. It shows a launch sequence recorded in late 1960, months before Gagarin's triumph. Ledovskikh wasn't a celebrity. He was a test pilot, a man accustomed to flying the impossible. He was strapped into a capsule that was barely pressurized with a life support system that was more a theory than a reality. He knew the risks, but in 1960, no wasn't an option. You didn't decline the party. You either became a hero or you became a secret. The night of the launch was bone-chilling. There were no news crews, no cheering crowds, just a handful of engineers and a wall of KGB minders. As Ledovskikh sat in that cramped, dark metal sphere, lit only by the red glow of a single dashboard light, he must have known he was standing on a trapdoor. The countdown wasn't a countdown to glory, it was a countdown to the unknown. When the engines ignited, the ground didn't just shake, it roared with the sound of a secret being born. The rocket tore through the Siberian sky, a lone, flickering spark of human ambition moving toward a void that had never been breached. Ledovskikh was in orbit. He had done it. He was the first. But as the capsule cleared the atmosphere and the Earth began to curve beneath him, the first mechanical failure began to chime in the silence. The descent had begun, but not the one he was trained for. For the first few hours, the Soviet command center was jubilant. The telemetry was holding. Aleksei Ledovskikh had done the impossible. He had reached the high ground. But as the capsule prepared for its deorbit burn over the Pacific, something went catastrophically wrong. A single valve in the retro rocket system jammed, frozen by the absolute zero of the void. Instead of slowing down to hit the atmosphere at the correct angle, the engines fired with a jagged, uneven thrust. It didn't push him down. It pushed him out. In the tracking stations below, The engineers watched in frozen horror as the digital blip representing Ledovskikh's life began to drift away from the calculated path. He wasn't falling home. He was climbing into a graveyard. While Moscow scrambled to enact a total communications blackout, they forgot about the amateurs. In a converted bunker in Turin, Italy, two brothers, Achille and Giovanni Judica-Cordiglia, were listening. They had built their own tracking station, a web of antennas designed to eavesdrop on the space race. On that cold night in 1960, they caught a signal that wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't the rhythmic beep of a satellite. It was a human heartbeat, rapid, panicked, then slowing into a rhythmic, terrifying calm. Then came the voice. Distorted by static, weaving through the radiation of the Van Allen belt, a man was reciting numbers. Technical data, oxygen levels, battery voltages. He wasn't screaming. He was a professional recording his own death for a country that had already decided to forget he existed. Imagine the view from that single 4-inch thick porthole. The Earth, once a vast home, shrinking into a marble of blue and white. In space, there is no sound of wind, no hum of life, only the mechanical clicking of a failing life support system and the sound of your own breath. Ledovskikh was no longer a pilot. He was the inhabitant of a silver coffin. The Italian recordings capture a moment where the technical recitations stop. There is a long silence, nearly 30 seconds of nothing but the crackle of the cosmos, and then a single sentence, whispered in Russian. The stars, they're so cold. Tell them I did my duty. He knew. He knew that even if he could scream loud enough for the whole world to hear, the Kremlin would simply turn up the static. As the capsule reached its new, unintended orbit, it moved into the zone of silence, a dead spot where even the Italian brothers couldn't reach him. The last telemetry received by the Soviet stations showed a cabin temperature dropping below freezing. The power was gone. Aleksei Ledovskikh, the first man to see the curvature of the Earth in its entirety, was now drifting in a permanent loop. To the world, he was nothing. To the military, he was an anomaly in the data. By the time the sun rose over Baikonur the next morning, his name had been scrubbed from the mission board. The phantom cosmonaut was gone. But as we move into the next chapter, we'll see that you can't bury a man in space and expect him to stay hidden. Because years later, the ghost started to move. While Aleksei Ledovskikh was still breathing in the dark of his orbit, the wheels of the state were already turning to erase him. By the time the Italian brothers were recording his final whispers, the order had come directly from the Kremlin. The mission never happened. To the Soviet Union, a dead hero was a liability, but a missing one was a catastrophe. Within 48 hours, the engineering team at the secret Siberian site was disbanded. Men who had worked side by side for months were loaded onto separate trains, headed for different isolated research stations in the Urals. They were given a choice that wasn't a choice. Stay silent and live, or speak and become a footnote in a different kind of archive. Then came the visual purge. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union were masters of photographic manipulation. We've seen the famous images of Stalin where his enemies slowly disappear from the frame one by one. First Trotsky, then Yezhov. The same fate befell Ledovskikh. In the official group shots of the early cosmonaut corps, you can see the anomalies. A hand resting on a shoulder that belongs to no one. A shadow on the ground where a man should be standing. a gap in a lineup of pilots that feels unnaturally wide. These phantom photos are the only physical proof left behind, scars on the face of history where the truth was surgically removed. The living shadows. But what about the families? In the closed cities or Zatos, secret towns like Chelyabinsk 70 that didn't appear on any map, the families of the lost were gathered. Ledovskikh's wife was reportedly told her husband had died in a routine high-altitude flight over the Arctic. His body, they said, was unrecoverable. She was given a modest pension and a stern warning. Do not talk to the neighbors. Do not ask for a funeral. And do not mention his name to the press. These families became living shadows, walking reminders of a sacrifice that the state refused to acknowledge. They lived in comfortable apartments provided by the KGB, a gilded cage to ensure the phantom cosmonauts stayed in the dark. The perfection of Gagarin. On April 12th, 1961, the world finally got what it wanted, a successful hero. Yuri Gagarin's smile was the perfect weapon for the Cold War. He was young, he was handsome, and most importantly, he was alive. His success was so total that it effectively buried the failures that came before him. If Gagarin was the light, Ledovskikh was the shadow. The archives were sealed, the launch pads were dismantled, and the world moved on. But for those who still listen to the shortwave radio bands, the story didn't end in 1960. Because as we move into the final chapter, we look at what modern sensors found drifting in high orbit in 2026. A tomb that refused to fall. The debris of history. In the modern era, the space above our heads is no longer a silent void. It is a crowded highway of silicon and steel. Thousands of satellites track our movements, our weather, and our secrets. But among the high-tech sensors of 2026, there are anomalies that the software is programmed to ignore, objects that don't belong to any modern launch manifest. One such object is cataloged by deep space tracking stations as Object 1960 Alpha. For decades, it was dismissed as a spent rocket stage or a stray piece of solar shielding. But as private space corporations began launching high-altitude cleaner satellites to map orbital debris, the resolution of our eyes in the sky finally caught up with the truth. The resolution of truth. In early 2026, a high-resolution imaging satellite from a private Swiss firm captured a series of frames while passing through a high eccentricity orbit. The image wasn't of a jagged piece of scrap metal. It was a sphere, scorched, pitted by micrometeoroids and draped in the tattered remains of thermal blankets. On its side, barely visible through the radiation-faded paint, were 3 letters. Sup, the mark of the Soviet control center. But it was the porthole that froze the analysts. The glass was frosted from the inside, a thick layer of ice and crystallized oxygen covering the view. Behind that ice, a shape was visible, a silhouette that hasn't changed in 66 years. Aleksei Ledovskikh hadn't fallen. He had become a permanent satellite, a frozen monument to a race that left him behind. The rhythmic signal. The most haunting evidence, however, isn't visual, it's auditory. Radio hobbyists using modern digital signal processing have returned to the frequencies recorded by the Italian brothers in 1960. When they scrubbed the cosmic background radiation and the interference from Starlink constellations, they find a rhythmic pulse. Scientists call it a thermal vent. The sound of the capsule's remaining pressurized gases expanding and contracting as it moves from the shadow of the Earth into the heat of the sun. But to those who know the story, it sounds like something else. It sounds like a slow, steady breath, a heartbeat made of static, a ghost that refuses to stop transmitting its presence to a world that was told he never existed. The final word. As we look up at the night sky tonight, we see the blinking lights of progress. We see the future, no, but somewhere in the darkness. Between the stars, Object 1960 Alpha continues its lonely circle. Aleksei Ledovskikh was the first human to break the bonds of Earth, only to be imprisoned by the silence of his own country. He is a reminder that history isn't just written by the winners, it is edited by the powerful. But the vacuum of space has no political agenda. It preserves the truth in a deep freeze, waiting for the day we are brave enough to look up and acknowledge the shadows. Gagarin was the hero we were given. Ledovskikh is the truth we discovered, and the truth has a way of staying on the line.